Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Sometimes history feels like a coiled spring,
Yeah.
Like you push for progress and make some headway, but then, bam, the tension snaps back and throws everything in a whole new direction.
The great analogy.
And that's kind of what we're looking at today with these Black Power and Black nationalism movements.
Yeah.
We're going deep on this one, really trying to unpack all the layers of this Mr. Hutchings History podcast, episode 27.
Okay.
To understand how this energy, this frustration, how it really reshaped the fight for racial equality in America.
And it's a pivotal moment because it really challenges this sort of common narrative that we have about the civil rights movement being this straight line towards equality.
Right.
The reality is far more complex, and even after landmark legal victories like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, you still had this profound sense of frustration brewing.
It's like winning the legal battle, but then you realize that the war is far from over.
Right.
So many Black Americans were still facing the daily realities of segregation and discrimination, and often just outright violence.
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be incredibly disheartening, to say the least.
It was, and this is where someone like Stokely Carmichael becomes so crucial, I think, to understanding this shift in energy. You had SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a group deeply involved in, for instance, the fight for voting rights down south.
Right.
But even within organizations like SNCC, by the mid-60s, there's this growing feeling that integration alone isn't enough.
Okay, so let's talk about this Carmichael guy for a sec. He steps up during this march in Mississippi back in 1966 and just drops this, what seemed like at the time, this bombshell, right? Black Power. Now, I've heard that phrase countless times. What did it actually mean in that moment?
It was electrifying, you know, like a true call to action. For Carmichael, Black Power, it represented this fundamental shift in mindset. It was about Black Americans taking control of their own narratives, their communities, their destinies. He was challenging the very notion that equality could be granted by the white establishment.
It had to come from within.
Exactly.
And this message, it really resonated, especially among younger activists who were just tired of waiting for change to slowly trickle down.
Absolutely. And it's here that we start to see a real divergence, I think, in the movement. Groups like the Nation of Islam, the NOI, take this idea of self-reliance even further.
Right.
Advocating for complete separation from white society.
Now, the NOI is fascinating to me because they brought this whole other dimension to the table with their unique interpretation of Islam.
Right. And this wasn't just about finding a different religion.
Right.
They saw Christianity as inherently tied to the oppression that they were facing. It was, a tool that was used to pacify and to control Black people. Islam, for them, represented this return to their African roots.
Yeah.
A source of strength, of empowerment in a world that was actively trying to deny them both.
Yeah, and they had some pretty radical beliefs to go along with that, like the concept of Yaqub.
Right.
Something that I've always found a little perplexing.
Yeah, so Yaqub, according to their teachings, was this evil scientist who essentially created white people as a race of devils.
Wow.
It's a very complex, and controversial concept, but it's key to understanding how the NOI viewed race relations as this inherent battle between good and evil, Black and white.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
It is.
And then, of course, you have Malcolm X, probably one of the most well-known figures associated with the NOI. And he didn't shy away from controversy. In fact, he seemed to embrace it.
Oh, absolutely. Malcolm X, during his time with the NOI, was this incredibly powerful orator. He tapped into this raw anger and frustration that many Black Americans felt, particularly in the face of this continued violence and oppression. He talked about self-defense. He talked about Black pride. He talked about not asking for a seat at the table when you can build your own.
So a very different approach than, say, Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolence.
Exactly. And while Malcolm X's rhetoric, it was often seen as inflammatory, dangerous even by some, he provided a voice to a segment of the Black community that felt increasingly disillusioned by the slow pace of change, by the ongoing brutality that they were facing.
But then Malcolm X takes this trip to Mecca, and man, talk about a turning point. It's like this entire worldview that he had built up, it just starts to shift right before our eyes.
Mecca was a revelation for him. Imagine here he is, this man who had built his reputation on this idea of separation from white society. And he finds himself surrounded by Muslims of every race and color and creed, all united in prayer. And it fundamentally challenged his understanding of race and religion.
Yeah, that's got to be a pretty jarring experience, like seeing the world in a whole new light.
Yeah.
So how did this impact his message? Like, how did this experience in Mecca change what he was saying when he came back?
It's a dramatic shift. After Mecca, Malcolm X breaks away from the Nation of Islam. He starts talking about this more inclusive struggle for, for human rights. He acknowledges that white people can be allies in this fight for justice.
Wow.
This is huge. He even founds his own organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAAU, which reflected this broader vision.
Okay, so he's challenging his own previous beliefs. He's building bridges instead of walls.
Mm.
That kind of evolution takes some serious courage.
It does.
Yeah.
And tragically, his life is cut short, just as he's embarking on this new path.
Right.
Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965, leaving behind this incredibly complex and really multifaceted legacy.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. But his words, his journey, they continue to inspire people to this day. He really embodies that spirit of questioning, of challenging the status quo, even when it means challenging yourself, which is, it's not easy to do.
It's not easy at all. And it's in this context of, transformation and sadly tragedy that a group like the Black Panther Party emerges.
Mm-hmm.
And they take inspiration from Malcolm X's teachings on self-defense,
Okay.
but they translate it into this more direct confrontational approach.
So if Malcolm X's later years were about global unity and recognizing that there are these shared struggles that we all face as human beings, the Panthers are bringing the fight right back to the streets of America.
Mm.
And they were not messing around. They were armed, they were organized, and they were ready to challenge police brutality head on.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting because the Panthers are often portrayed in this very, one-dimensional way as solely focused on militancy. But when you really dig deeper, like in this Mr. Hutchings episode that you're referencing, you see a much more nuanced picture.
Okay, so unpack that for me. What else was going on beyond just the images of these armed patrols that we always see in the history books?
Well, for starters, their name, the Black Panther Party, it was very intentional.
Yeah.
They saw themselves as protectors of their communities, directly confronting what they viewed as an occupying force in their neighborhoods.
Hmm.
The police, cop watching, became one of their signature tactics, patrolling the streets, monitoring police activity, and exercising their right to bear arms.
Yeah, that's something that Mr. Hutchings really emphasizes in the podcast, how the Panthers were meticulously studying their legal rights, particularly around gun laws, to challenge police harassment. It's like they were turning the tables on the system.
Exactly. They were essentially saying, we're not going to be intimidated anymore. We know our rights, and we're prepared to defend ourselves. Now, whether you agree with their tactics or not, they undeniably brought the issue of police brutality into the national spotlight.
It was a bold move, that's for sure. But they weren't just about confrontation, right? What about those community programs that Mr. Hutchings kept mentioning?
This is what I mean about nuance. The Black Panther Party, they were deeply invested in community upliftment. They understood that true liberation, it meant addressing the systemic inequalities that plagued Black communities.
Okay, so give me some specifics. What did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, one of their most impactful initiatives was the Free Breakfast for Children program. They recognized that so many kids in their communities, they were going to school hungry, unable to, to focus, to learn.
Of course.
So they set up these kitchens and they started serving like thousands of these free, nutritious breakfasts every single day.
That's incredible. I had no idea that it was on such a large scale.
It was. And that's just one example. They also established these free health clinics in Black neighborhoods. They provided clothing and transportation assistance. They even offered free ambulance services.
Wow, they were like this parallel social service organization challenging the government to step up and meet the needs of its citizens.
Precisely. And what's so fascinating is that this commitment to community service, it often gets overshadowed by their more militant image.
Right.
But these programs, they were hugely popular and incredibly effective at addressing some very real problems that these communities were facing.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about. The Panthers are out there running these incredibly successful social programs,
right.
And yet at the same time, they're seen as this dangerous threat by the government.
Well, the irony is palpable, right? And I think Mr. Hutchings does a great job in this episode, breaking down how the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover at the time, they saw the Panthers as a major target.
Right.
They had this program, COINTELPRO, which was aimed at, disrupting and discrediting Black activist groups. Mm-hmm. And the Panthers were, they were right at the top of their list.
COINTELPRO.
Yeah.
That just sounds shady.
It was. We're talking about surveillance, infiltration, spreading misinformation, even, instigating violence to sow discord within the party. It's a dark chapter in American history, and it really highlights just how much the Panthers were shaking things up.
Yeah, and ultimately it worked, right? I mean, the Black Panther Party, it eventually fades from the scene.
It's complicated. COINTELPRO definitely played a role in their decline, but there were also these internal divisions, personality clashes, and frankly, just the sheer exhaustion of constantly being targeted. It takes a toll.
Yeah.
And by the mid-70s, the Black Panther Party, as this centralized organization, it had largely fallen apart.
Okay, so they weren't able to sustain that initial momentum that they created, but, I mean, their impact is undeniable. When we look back at this whole era, Black Power, Black nationalism, for you, what's the most important takeaway? Like, when you think about this period, what really sticks with you?
I think for me, it's about understanding the power of challenging assumptions, of demanding more. The civil rights movement, it made incredible progress on the legal front, but these movements, they said, that's not enough. We want control over our communities, over our economies, over our own destinies.
And that's a message that I think still resonates really strongly today. You see it in movements like Black Lives Matter, the fight for economic justice, the push for representation in media, in politics.
Absolutely. The legacy of Black Power is, it's all around us. It's about self-determination. It's about pride in one's heritage. It's about refusing to be silent in the face of injustice.
You mentioned Black nationalism earlier, and that's a term that sometimes, gets thrown around with these negative connotations.
Yeah.
But isn't there an element of Black nationalism that's actually very empowering?
Absolutely. And it's important, I think, to make this distinction. Black nationalism, it's not about hating other groups. It's about loving and empowering your own. Yeah. It's about building institutions that serve the needs of your community. It's about celebrating your history, your culture, and it's about having agency over your own future.
So it's less about exclusion, and it's more about self-love and empowerment within the context of a society that has historically denied those things, those very things, to Black Americans.
Exactly. And you see that thread, I think, running through all of these movements that we've been discussing, from Stokely Carmichael's call for Black Power to the Black Panther Party's community programs, It's about recognizing that true equality requires more than just legal rights. It requires this fundamental shift in power dynamics.
This whole deep dive has been, it's been really eye-opening for me. We've gone from these electrifying moments of protest and defiance to the nuanced realities of social programs and community organizing. And it's clear that this fight for racial justice, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Not a sprint.
And there are so many different approaches to actually achieving that goal.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, the most important thing we can do is to continue to learn from these movements, to have those, those uncomfortable conversations, and to really challenge ourselves to imagine and build a more just and equitable future.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, but I'm left with this one question echoing in my head. If Black Power was the rallying cry of the 1960s, what does that look like in the 21st century? What forms does it take? How do we continue to challenge the status quo, to strive for true equality in a world that's constantly evolving? That's something that I'll definitely be pondering. And for you listening, what resonated with you most? What threads do you see connecting the past to the present? Keep those questions in mind as you move through the world today.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.